Clarity by Dragonson, Chapter 18. Hide. Ruby sat in the school library with an attitude that for once matched the somber setting, but whereas the books were still stacked in neat rows and columns, alphabetized and prioritized, everything else was falling apart around her. It had been 24 hours since Blake disappeared, and so far there had been no real effort to find her. In all honesty, she had hoped the girl would return in the morning, but not only did this not pan out, now she was exhausted from trying for staying up all night waiting. She was also waiting for her other teammates to grow up, with Weiss and Yang locked in an argument about the situation since yesterday. With no end in sight, Ruby had tried to intervene multiple times, but she was instantly rebuffed and/or ignored by the older girls, something which she had sadly gotten used to during her short tenure as captain. "Some leader I am," Ruby whimpered, flipping through her notebook as if she had penned the message in the margins, giving her advice for such an occasion. She turned the pages absently back and forth until, lo and behold, she came upon that she failed to recognize as her own. She must have been so bored at the time that she didn't remember sketching it. The picture was that of a fox sleeping soundly under a tree. The look on its face could have been apathetic or content. It was hard to tell. It was a crude drawing, granted, but she was better at drawing weapons, schematics. Organic stuff wasn't her forte at all. "What would you do?" she asked the fox, her mind like it must have been back then, clearly on him. "What would who do?" Ruby looked up to see John standing in front of her along with Carden. Ruby asked, not hiding her surprise at seeing the two of them together. "Still, this is going to be a thing for a while, isn't it?" The ginger growled, and before he could change his mind asked, "What are you doing, Shrimp?" "Nothing," she admitted, "which is a problem since Blake is still gone." "You mean the goth that ran out of your room?" her fellow captain asked. "I don't think Blake can be considered goth," John reasoned. "More emo or loner, if anything. Only you could simultaneously defend and insult someone in the same sentence," Carden sighed. "So I take it she never came back last night?" "No," Ruby admitted. "I'm trying to go and find her, but the rest of the team won't listen to me." Carden patiently took a seat and prepared himself for what was likely going to be a very long and emotional unloading by the younger girl, except that it wasn't, and he waited and waited and and what? Ruby reflected his own look of confusion. "I can't get them to listen?" Carden blinked. "You do realize that you're the leader of your team, right?" This was the same girl who confidently gave everyone unwarranted advice and against all rationale took on a group of trained killers twice. "Just make them." "It's not that simple," the Rose tried. "Actually, yes, it really is," Cardin argued, looking around waiting for someone to yell, "Gotcha." "This is a crisis situation. Literally the time for you to grab your team and give them orders. But why won't they listen to me?" "Then make them," the captain and the C of Cardinal reiterated, confident from experience. "You're a leader, and sometimes that means making decisions your team won't be happy about." "I'm trying, but it might be too late. I messed up bad." And for once, Ruby was the one in need of motivational support. A scary thought, should any of them slip. "I should have stopped the fight earlier on, but didn't." She felt her head hit the table hard, but she was beaten up on herself so badly anyway it didn't matter. "No, Blake's out, who knows where, and I can't even get my own teammates in the same room without them yelling at each other and ignoring me." "Yeah, you did fuck up," Cardin allowed. "Your team's internal issues should have been nipped in the bud sooner than this." Ruby flinched at the harsh words, but didn't object to them. "But then my team could start to be more diligent in our duties," Cardin continued. "If we had been better prepared, then maybe you wouldn't have been lost in the forest." Ruby looked up at the boy to find him looking anywhere but her. Had he been blaming himself for that his whole time? "And if I had been a better hand on my skills, then I wouldn't burden mine so much as I do," John added, trying not to feel sorry for himself. This wasn't his turn after all. A captain who's completely reliant on his team isn't much of a leader. No team starts out perfect, and we're learning as leaders together. Cardin finished on what he'd hoped was a positive and not this genuine note. Besides, it's only right we support a fellow huntsman when they need us, John added, standing next to Cardin, resting an arm on his shoulder. Get off of me. His fellow leader leapt at the growled command. Thank you, Ruby smiled. Both of you, she emphasized, looking at her least likely ally. Whatever. The mace wielder turned his nose up and turned away, not about to let her see how much he appreciated this. In any case, we'll head out with you, Cardin informed. I'll take my team and we'll fan out with yours to search the city. I'll stay here with my team in case she shows up while you're gone, John added. Plus, if she tries to run again, we'll make sure she doesn't. It sounds like a plan, Ruby agreed, nodding at the two boys before stalking back to her dorm. She had two teammates to get under control. Clarity. Do I? Did he have to say anything? She had remained fixed as a street lamp as he nearly ran headlong into her. Lights on, but nobody home, still beaming that empty smile at him. Maybe she was just like the lights in the bathroom, on a motion sensor, and if he just remained still. The girl cocked her head, changing her whole expression. Expectant. She had given him her name, Penny Paladina, and was waiting for something in return. Should I know you? She wore an expression akin to his teammate's sigh, but not. No, on second thought, the two looks were as dissimilar as everything else: color, gender, disposition, or as I seemed to have trouble figuring out where to show joy from the few seconds he'd spent under the relentless smile of this strange girl. Kitsune got the feeling that she had a hard time finding an excuse not to be happy. Great, another one. I do not believe we have met. Naruto did not believe her for a second. Maybe she was telling the truth, but was as out of practice as he was. Oh, but it would be just as spectacular if we got more acquainted. Without meaning to boast, I can be quite helpful. You seem to be in a rush. Were you looking to catch a bullhead? I have memorized the list of schedules along with alternative routes via train, taxi, or foot, if that is what you prefer. Or perhaps you have lost something. My senses are all above standard, and I would object to help you look for it. Everything was over emoted, very much like an actor in one of those bad soap operas Sakura liked to watch on their downtime. Not that Kitsune was a very good judge of character himself, but what if this girl were like himself? What had she been doing there if not waiting for the opportunity to strike? Was it rude of me to ask what you're doing in an isolated part of Vale Commercial District? Is that why you're not responding? On second thought, perhaps she was just as oblivious as she seemed, as dangerous combination of earnest and inept, like the unholy progeny of himself and that do-gooder huntress. And wasn't that a disturbing thought? I sense discomfort and your facial regions are exhibiting increased blood flow. Are you perhaps feeling ill? Though it was far more disturbing how the girl had gotten so close to him without triggering his danger senses. Naruto nearly given himself a whiplash when he jerked his head away from her inquiring hand and slapping it away. Penny blinked as her concerned gesture was rebuffed. What had she done wrong? Was this not how people without accurate thermal equipment gauge temperature? Oh, is this perhaps one of those preparatory handshakes I have heard about? Hands suddenly clasped together, a gasp that was like the resealing of nitrous, and green eyes lit up, signaling the start of something far, far out of Naruto's control. Oh, does that mean we're friends? The F word. If Kitsune hadn't been comfortable with his mission thus far, this was the last straw, the biggest of black flags as he waved the white, a turning tail, and took to the rooftops. Even if his mission had not already been compromised, it had just become 10 times more difficult. He felt Penny's eyes tracking him in his flight as sharp as an eagle's, or perhaps even Sasuke's. Just what was this girl? Are we playing a game? Is this hide and go seek or tag? What kind of cruel game was life playing with him, setting him first the incessant huntress, and now this idiot savant, both who seemed able to keep up with him and make his life miserable? Well, more so. Added to that was Dogal. What would he say about this? Did he have any info on this Penny Paladina and not tell him? Or worse, does she now have info on them? He had no doubt that she'd seen through his disguise the way she'd seen through his clothes, his skin, to read his temperature and stress levels, which were increasing along with the distance he put between the two. She did not move, but shouted after him, "Okay, I shall be it. When should be this next target?" Or was he now hers? "Worry not, friend. I will find you, and when I do, you will tell me which game we are playing." This time, Naruto believed her. Clarity. Ruby stepped through her door without purpose, her narrow silver eyes landing on their target like a rifle sight. The sight of Yang and Wei still engaged in the argument from the past day only spurred her on, pulling the trigger. "Hey!" The two older girls immediately went silent, at least until they realized it was her, and then relaxed, taking a mutual truce to deal with the interruption. "Ruby, now is not the time." Yang sighed. "Yes, whatever. I don't want to hear it," we said. "I don't have time." "Silence!" We felt her entire body jump at the sudden command. She turned towards Ruby, who was fixing her with a glare far more scathing than she thought the kindly girl capable of. Her own sister was equally transfixed with the sudden viciousness from the young Rose, in that moment not even recognizing her kin. Ruby recognized that there was still unresolved issues with her team, but she had been listening to them argue long enough. They were getting nowhere and were still no closer to finding Blake. Enough was enough. It was time to be a leader. "I don't care that you don't want to go out and look for Yang," she scolded, looking over at Whis before turning to her sister. "I don't care that you don't feel like listening to me. I don't care about your attitudes either. I don't care." "Ruby," Yang was cut off with Ruby's raised hand, sharp as a knife. "Our teammate is missing. Do you understand what that means?" Having to talk down to the two elder women like they were toddlers, the silver-eyed girl scowled. "It means we are a team that fell apart before we even got started, and I will not let that stand." Out of the corner of her eyes she saw Louise open her mouth, but with those same eyes fixed her with a glare that made the white-haired woman wisely clamped up. "So now all three of us are going out there to Vale to look for Blake," she continued, keeping both teammates under close scrutiny. "And before you try to argue, this is a direct order from your leader." Yang and Whis were completely gobsmacked. The leader had finally decided to bare her fangs, and not needing to say anything else, Ruby walked out the door, indicating for them to follow. "Come on!" The two older girls jumped at the words before rushing out of the room to hurry after their team captain. Clarity. It was the first time the Gaul actually appeared truly put out with him, and Naruto had a difficult time not feeling disappointed with himself. It wasn't his fault that he hadn't found anything, not if there was truly nothing to be found, but in the off chance that he had missed something so glaring as a stolen Atlas super robot, the Gaul had continued to send a maskless Kitsune on solo missions to infiltrate otherwise observe White Fang gatherings over the next few weeks. Before, Kitsune wouldn't have questioned this dodged, some Sakura might say obsessive approach, but Naruto was beginning to form the opinion that the Gaul was unable to admit he was wrong this time. To be fair, the man was practically an establishment among the assassins. As much as they had such a person of notoriety, he couldn't afford to be wrong. One way or another, heads would roll. The missions were beginning to mess with Naruto's head. Before this, he'd not been on a solo mission since the last time he'd been without a mask in public was the only other person besides Kagejiji who had ever called him by his name was, and he never thought of himself as Naruto before this. Anyway, the assassins, his squad, was his identity. Now he was a Faunus, whether he agreed to it or not. His presence at the gatherings was becoming a constant, and he'd almost panicked when receiving a nod from one of the more stoic White Fang guards. It was probably a good thing Namekuji, who was still his personal physician, had denied him a cyanide pill. Obviously, he hadn't ever had to use one, but there was the question whether or not it would even work with his constitution, and the last thing he wanted was to be lying on the floor amid the faunus gathering and frothing at the mouth, but still every much alive for interrogation. So far, he hadn't even had to give anyone his alias, and he was fairly confident none of the other attendees would recognize him outside of this very specific context. The makeup covering his whiskers and the dyeing of his hair were subtle but significant changes. His foxtail was now golden, more like the plant, while the top of his head held a tawn brown, which was the darkest color it would take. It would take someone with a very keen eye to suss him out, and the only one he thought capable of it wouldn't be caught dead in this city side of town. Okay, poor choice of words, but the Huntress still had no reason to leave Beacon's campus, which was like a city unto itself with all the staff and facilities. Even if she and her teammate were to go into town for recreation, Vale was large, and the chances they'd run into one another were infinitesimally small. Right? Naruto couldn't help throwing a look over his shoulder like a pinch of salt. Paranoia wasn't something he thought he suffered from. Being the assassin's perfect weapon, he was always a very real threat to his life, both from without and within the organization. But he was so far out of their jurisdiction now. There weren't random groups of assassins patrolling Vale 24/7. They ventured into the populous areas to strike at a target and then retreated like vipers. Long-term missions were all but unheard of. Exposure for one risked exposing them all. Then again, the assassins by nature tended not to talk much. Naruto himself was allowed to move and report at his own discretion, so no one ought to know that he was currently stalking a White Fang patrol that had seemingly wandered outside of their own territory. Not unless he had a tail which had been following him for some time, which he triple checked to make sure wasn't the case. Not until Dogal was right. If such were true, there was a very good chance that he would cross in blades with one of his comrades sooner or later, though in that case they would no longer be his comrades. Neither Naruto nor Kitsune would have any compulsion about killing a traitor. That word itself, however, was problematic considering he'd been in the care and command of a traitor for some time. He had done countless things under this rogue assassin, which no doubt went against the Jiji Kage's wishes, not to say crimes against Remnant. Was he a traitor? It would explain the other council members' contempt for him, as well as Jiji Kame's sorrowful glance at Naruto when he thought the young killer couldn't see. Kitsune could see he was a burden, which was why he always his own harsh critic. Why Jin had nothing on the internal infernal voice which marked his failures. His reliance upon its dark power whenever he wasn't strong enough to fight his own battles. It was always demanding to be released, bargaining with him to snap the buckles on his arm, which did more than restrict his blood flow. Power, untampered bloodlust, which one ran rampant throughout his body, had been confined to just a single limb and then sealed by the most potent and arcane magics the assassin possessed. From what he understood, it had been a collaborative effort amongst the various branches. Now that he thought about it, being who he was, Dogal probably had a hand in that decision, and Naruto couldn't help but wonder which side the man had been on. The Intel chief seemed like the kind of person to take the prudent approach, eliminating something before it became a threat. Although Naruto had to admit that Dogal often had a unique voice of reason. However, it didn't make matter if he owed the man his life. This was his duty, the one thing he absolutely couldn't screw up. It was his one point of pride that since he'd been properly sealed, he'd never needed to loosen more than a single strap, and even then, Kitsune had been able to maintain control for the most part because of his careful, cultivated emotional mask. However, ever since he'd spent those weeks with the confounded huntress, he was beginning to question that. What if by maintaining that mask he was failing his comrades, his friends? They trusted him with their lives, their feelings, dreams, personalities, their names. By denying those things for himself, was he betraying their trust? Hey, did you hear something? Nah, man, you're imagining things. Quit being so paranoid. advice that Kitsune himself could follow as he nearly betrayed his position with an ill-placed step on the fire escape which caused the rust metal to groan in its mooring. There was another problem with long-term reconnaissance missions. They left too much time for distraction. Hey, it's not being paranoid if someone's out there to get you. You think we ought to trust these outsiders? The outsider to their conversation perked up at this bit of info. It was the first explicit mention of collaboration between the White Fang and another party, and it was so blatant as to be unbelievable. Oi, oi, why don't you take those outsiders' advice and shut your trap? They've got the ears too, not to mention fangs. Just 'cause they got a few token faunus. People like that, their mercenary attitude makes them no better than traitors to the cause. No worse than Torchwick, though, right? I can't stand that scumbag. There's a guy too big for his britches. Probably why he carts around the Lolita-looking girl, am I right? Or fuck, man, I didn't know who creeps me out more. She's always got this glint in her eyes like a dog in heat whenever there's a whiff of blood. Hey, I take offense to that. She's way worse. At least I can control myself around a bitch. Speaking of offensive, you do realize I'm a girl, right? Yeah, but you're different. Besides, I think those other guys are different too. They're on another level of creepiness. I know what you mean. It's not just the masks. They've got the whole total lack of expression. Why do you pretending parrots want to end up as chicken dinner? Come on, Chief, that was a low blow. I thought we were above stereotypes. Certain behaviors were ingrained, like the tendency for predatory animals not to look above them, no matter how much the human half of the brain acknowledged that they weren't at the top of the food chain. High places such as roofs and ladder tops were safe from the not paranoid glances of the faunus group, the one prey animal in their patrol. The brightly colored parrot man was now otherwise occupied with his hang-dog look of self-pity. Kitsune wasn't worried about being caught by any of them now that he was fully invested in his mission. Their conversation piqued his attention, prickling the hairs on the back of his neck. It stunk of fear, the kind of nervous banter that his own team often resorted to when they treated him like a human bomb. It wasn't their boss these Faunus were afraid of, though, but whoever they were meeting, and therefore Kitsune should be wary as well. He hung back when he thought was a safe distance, just enough not to let the group out of his sight in their circus path. And unlike the other Faunuses, he had one eye open to the taller building to make sure no one was doing the same for him. And then the group ducked into a tunnel, and Naruto cursed. Well, not really. That would have been just plain unprofessional and probably given him away. But now he had a dilemma that would have been easy to solve had he been with his team. Should he risk pursuing them on the ground or try to cover their most likely point of exit? The second option came with its own risk of missing a potential handoff or meeting. Concealing positions such as the underside of bridges and the mouths of alleyways were notorious blind spots for cameras, not to mention classic haunts favored by the assassins themselves for such purposes. It only took him a few milliseconds to make his choice, too short a time to properly weigh the risk and benefits. It went against his training to be so impulsive, but maybe that was also part of his decision. If he could defy his indoctrination even this little bit, it would ironically be proof that he wasn't a traitor, that he was different from them. If he could conquer himself, he could overcome the voices inside. Those who dare win. Everything else about his approach was textbook. There were certain risks that were foolish to ignore, and Naruto had already made one stupid mistake so far in his pursuit. He was silent, swift, already planning 6 possible scenarios with the crescending escape routes in the time it took him to descend like a fallen leaf from the gutter he was perched on. This wasn't very many, and most of his opinions would be more inconvenient than the cyanide pill. There wasn't a whole lot of concealment leading up to the bridge's concrete overhang, and his best excuse should he be caught was that he was just passing through, taking an out-of-the-way route underneath the footbridge in the middle of a sprawling populated industrial district. Right, That was a worse excuse than some of the ones the huntress had concocted when flustered, and Kitsune was not confident that he could pull off the same innocent, puppy dog eyes the way she could. Talking about ingrained responses, how had that technique even worked on him? The times that Mikuchi had tried to use it on him hadn't yielded any effect. Then again, that was before he started calling her Sakura. If only she were here to slap some sense into him, not that she would ever dare. He really was losing it. Though he had lost sight of the White Fang patrol, he could still hear them. It seemed that they still didn't have enough forethought to choose a bridge with good acoustics, but whoever they were talking with had taken this into account. Their voice a non-resonating murmur which, unlike whispers, had no peaks to distinguish words and didn't carry past the tunnel's entrance. It was another technique that was familiar to him. Was this what a bad vibe felt like? That was something he was still learning. Regardless, he was already committed. Focusing on the White Fangs half of the conversation wasn't enough to convince him they were embroiled in quite the nefarious plot.
It was simultaneously reassuring and rather nerve-wracking to hear the truth come out of them. In the end, being a wash, the perfect assassin worked towards becoming the words to memory. He needed to remember exactly what, as well as how it was said, since he only had half the context. Though the more he listened, the more disturbing the implications became, and the harder it was not to just ambush the conspirators right then and there. The five White Fang wouldn't be much of a problem, but the other party was a complete unknown, including their numbers. No, that wasn't a risk worth taking, not yet. At some point, though, the assassins would have to do something. From what he could glean, the White Fang were aiming for a monopoly on the dust, which wouldn't just affect the legitimate business in Vale, though that was where they were getting the majority of their resistance. All the criminal elements of Vale had erstwhile been bought off or become silent, like Junior. But what was it all for? Surely they would see that the other kingdoms wouldn't allow this to continue, for as much as they argued like the Assassins' Council, nobody wanted the Faunus to running a country like nobody wanted a demon running around free. The combined might of humanity's armies would come in and quash this fledgling rebellion before people saw an increase in their energy bills. Not unless the Fang had a military of their own. Were there enough of them for an army? Enough arms to go around? They would need military grade weaponry and support. Half of that Dogal had already banked on. But what was the other half of the question? Who was it? This suddenly became his prime concern, and Kitsune was once again grateful that Dogal gave him free rein of this assignment. It was daunting at first, being handed so much choice on how to conduct himself that he hadn't known what to do with it. But before he might have missed out on such an important connection, one that he had to concede originally came from his teammate, and he once again cursed Dogal for short-handing him his backup, people that were like his left and right arms and would have been invaluable at this juncture. When done, the White Fang troop left one side of the overpass, and Kitsune had to decide whether to wait in his hidey hole behind the stampede, shoot the metal trash can which barely concealed him, or try to pursue the other party. They might leave on the other side and expose himself before they left, could make him the prey. Impulsive barely emerged victorious again, and he was just about to break from cover when, as he left the shadowed concealment of the bridge, the masked man glanced over his shoulder at the trash can, whose lid shivered like a tambourine. Then a rat popped its head out, dropped onto the sidewalk, and skittered around the corner from which the man had just come. Just to be sure, though, he checked both behind and within the receptacle. There was nothing visible or disturbing besides what had been done by the rat, and uncovering no record devices, the masked man disappeared much like the rodent, taking to the tops of the metal-walled buildings which towered over the vacant square, never bothering to look up behind him. Kitsune clung to the side of the bridge like a gecko,
fingernails taken of the place of suction cups were almost unable to support his weight, and a small dribble of blood was leaking from where they threaded to peel off the concrete. What did wounds matter, though, if his heart had nearly stopped? Pain was trifle compared to the confused rage that what he had just seen. Just what the hell is going on? His body was taking on more animal features, the dye already boiling from his hair as the rivulets of blood from his fingers ate away at the bridge like acid. Why is an assassin helping the White Fang?